Hello, everyone. Welcome to this afternoon's webinar. We'll give folks a few minutes as it looks like people are still logging on, but just wanted to wish you a very hearty welcome. We'll give folks about another 30 seconds to log on, and then we'll go ahead and kick things off. All right, well, in the interest of time, we will go ahead and get started with things today since we have a slightly longer than normal webinar. First, I want to say welcome to everyone from the Educate for Opportunity cohort. We are very excited to have you on this afternoon for our fourth Educate for Opportunity cohort webinar. David, if you could flip to the next slide, please. So before we start, just a couple of logistical details. My name is John Elfuth, and I am a policy analyst on the NGA education team, and I'm also the state team lead for Ohio and the backup team lead for the Minnesota team. Just a couple of things too. Please first, if you can mute yourself if you are not a presenter, if you are not already muted. Second, at certain points, we just wanted to flag that we will ask some questions of the participants. When we do that, please type those responses in the chat box, not the Q&A box. However, throughout the webinar, we will also be dropping in various links to different publications and examples into the chat box as they are discussed. However, we probably won't drop every link, so if there is a reference to a program or a specific study that you are interested in, if we don't drop the link in, if you would also please just flag that for us. That would be wonderful. And also just to note, David asked if we are recording this. Yes, we are recording this as well. So the second to last thing, if you have any questions for us or for JFF during the webinar, if you could please type those into the Q&A box, and we will have several opportunities to have participation from the group today, and we'll try to answer them then. And then, as I already highlighted, we are going to be recording today's webinar, and we'll share the recording with the team once it is complete. Next slide, please. So a quick overview of today's agenda and a little background. Today's webinar is titled Building an Adult-Friendly Post-Secondary Policy Framework and features several of our friends from Jobs for the Future, also known as JFF. We asked JFF to be our presenter here today on this webinar because the organization collectively has over 15 years of experience working with states and post-secondary institutions in this area. The policy framework that they have put together holistically covers many of the priorities that you all collectively have for this project. And their extensive experience in this area has also given them a range of different examples and strategies that they can draw on that we believe will be of interest to you as you continue your work in both the Educate for Opportunity project and also as you continue working to respond to the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, especially related to serving adults. So first on the agenda, JFF will spend some time setting a brief context for the rest of the webinar, and then JFF will spend some time diving into their 4 policy focus areas, and within each of those areas highlight several different examples of how state and institutions are working together to create adult-friendly post-secondary education systems. Additionally, one thing we wanted to highlight that we're going to be trying something different today. Rather than have a presentation with a discussion at the end, we're going to intersperse 4 different discussion periods throughout each of the 4 sections that JFF will be presenting on. Our goal is to try to spend at least half of this webinar dedicated to state discussion time. So discussion questions will focus on whether a state is, where a state is on a particular element at the moment, additional examples that they would like to share with the group, and any follow-up questions that you may have for JFF or NGA staff. So to that end, we highly encourage you to be thinking about questions as we progress through each session. And again, feel free to drop those into the chat box as we go. Now, before turning things over to JFF, I did want to turn it over to my colleague, Michael Bartlett, also our Educate for Opportunity Project Manager, for any additional updates or comments you'd like to make. Mike?
Thanks so much, John. This is Mike here at NGA. I think John's done a nice job. No other major updates from our end. We're very much looking forward to seeing every state's innovation grant application here in the next few weeks. So with that, I'll kick it back to you, John.
David, the floor is yours. So you and your team, take it away.
Thanks, John. This is David Altstadt with JFF. At JFF, our mission is to build a society in which everyone has access to the skills, resources, and credentials needed to achieve economic advancement. To reach that goal, we work at the national, state, and local levels to accelerate the alignment, transformation, and reimagination of American workforce and education systems. JFF designs evidence-based models. We scale what works through national networks to drive systems change. We shape and influence policy conversations, and we invest capital to incubate new solutions, accelerate innovation, and drive impact. At JFF, I'm an associate director, and I work at the intersections of policy and practice. I am part of a team that partners with state and community college organizations and their institutions to scale guided pathways. I also work directly with post-secondary practitioners to lift up their perspectives on how federal and state policy can help rather than hinder efforts to improve equitable student success. I'm joined here by 3 of my colleagues, and I'm going to turn it over to each one of them to introduce themselves to you and share what they do at JFF. I'll turn it over to Sam first.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sam Finn. I'm a senior program manager in the Oakland office at JFF. And right now I'm working with the California Community College System on developing their new adult promise and competency-based education initiatives. I'm a former K-12 teacher myself, so I always have a special eye on how the pedagogy of things is working out in the higher ed level. Really excited to be here.
How about Jenny, would you like to go next?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Jennifer Freeman, and I've worked with community colleges and the workforce system around strategies to help adult learners for many years. For the last 5, working with JFF, I have led the Department of Labor TACT initiative, and which many of you are familiar with, I'm sure, and we're going to be drawing on examples from that. And I've worked with the Massachusetts community colleges on these issues.
And finally, Ashley.
Hi, everyone. Ashley Bliss Lima, and I sit on both the policy and what we call our learning team at JFF. A lot of my work focuses very specifically in Texas and in California, so a bit more of a state-based approach. And as Sam mentioned earlier, I'm also working very closely, relevant to today's conversation, with the California Community College Chancellor's Office and their competency-based education future implementation efforts as well. So thanks, looking forward to this conversation.
Thanks, Ashley. Before diving into policy and state examples, we thought we'd start with some insights about the current moment we find ourselves in and what that means for serving adults. So COVID-19 pandemic, as you know, is accelerating changes in the economy, revealing and exacerbating disparities in health and safety, economic security, and education and employment along racial, gender, and economic lines. It's disrupting education workforce systems and it's changing the job and skill needs for workers and learners, particularly for adults, the focus of today's webinar. We've seen through a number of data points, including great information from Strata, that they're seeing an increased demand for reskilling, upskilling, changing careers, and are really interested in accelerated education skills development opportunities, such as kind of non-degree programs. On today's webinar, we are going to explore what we know about state policy conditions and programmatic strategies that work for adults in these situations. First, it's important to remind ourselves that when we say adults, we're talking about a broad group with different education and skill experiences. Among the roughly 130 million adults aged 25 to 54, 58% do not have a college degree. Among minoritized populations, the percent of non-college adults rises to 67%. Meanwhile, only about 6 to 7% of adult population in any given academic year is currently enrolled in post-secondary education. In an era where we know the vast majority of jobs require education skills beyond a high school diploma, that means we are not actively serving the vast majority of adults who need more skills and credentials to advance in the economy. In attempting to engage and serve adults, it's important to acknowledge that it won't be easy and that there are no silver bullets to this work. As Rob Anderson from SHIO recently said, adult learners have complex needs. Many are working full-time jobs. Many are caregivers for children, parents, or both. Also, while many of these adults have some college credit, which is appealing, they also have very concrete reasons for having left college that must be addressed. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Sam Finn to share more about what we know about the motivations of adult learners and the obstacles in their way to credential and skill attainment. Sam? Oh, that's to say, before I do that though, good reminder, this is why we have slides. We wanted to get you involved in the conversation, and we're posing this question to you. As you're planning for fall, what do you see to be the biggest challenge in engaging adults? And we look forward to seeing your responses in the chat as Sam starts his presentation portion.
All right, so let's talk about adult learners. In understanding the characteristics of adult learners, it can be helpful to think where they might be different from the traditional younger student base that community colleges are typically designed for. So national research tells us a number of things about adult learners. So first of all, they're much more likely than younger students to have prior education, credentials, training that they might seek equivalent credit for. That just makes sense. Younger students wouldn't have had time to have done that. So credit for prior learning is a priority for them. Next, adult students are typically seeking more practical applications from their subject matter rather than the theoretical underpinnings. They want to see how they can apply what they learn to their life or their career right away. There's also a desire to be accepted and wanted and perhaps really planned for at the community college level, typically because the traditional college is designed for the traditional age student. Promotional materials, programs, schedules, everything are designed with a different sort of student body in mind. And so programs that reach out to adults are very appealing to them. Finally, we know that adult learners are much more likely than traditional learners to be attending college part-time. And I can drop a link around at least the part-time component into the chat. Let's go to the next slide. All right, so the primary motivations to go to college for adult learners. This comes from a national survey. The top 3 responses were initiating a career change, which was, I believe, 44%, getting ahead in a current job or career, which was 27%, and finally, learning and feeling accomplished, i.e. just learning for the sake of learning. But what we're seeing is that those top 2 motivations, that's 71% of all adult learners are saying that. So the majority of adult students going back to school, they're doing it to get ahead in their jobs or careers or to change them entirely. Let's go ahead to the next slide. So what are the barriers that adult learners are facing in their quest to advance their jobs and careers? Well, first and perhaps the biggest is time. Adults are working one or more jobs. They have childcare and family responsibilities, and there's often just not enough time to do as much coursework as they would like to do. On top of that, scheduling can be a major nightmare. If colleges are offering courses during the day or at inconvenient times, you just simply can't get to those courses. So time, first barrier. Money is a second barrier. So many adults are walking around with debt already, and there are concerns about the return on their investment in actually going to college and paying for these classes. So anytime that you can ameliorate that issue, anytime that you can make up for that tuition gap, that's extremely helpful. Given their schedule restraints and responsibilities around childcare, which is very expensive, that sort of indirectly goes into the money bucket as well. The final barrier to real access initially is a sort of self-advocacy and confidence component. A lot of adults just don't know where to get started. They've been disconnected from the system for some time, and they're a bit overwhelmed and uncertain about how to connect. Especially since colleges are really designed with traditional younger students in mind, and those are the majority of enrollments. They're worried about potentially feeling out of place. And many adult learners have had bad experiences in higher education in the past, some at for-profit colleges that really were not looking out for their best interests, and that may dissuade them from trying again. And I think we can go to the next slide now.
So turn it over to Jennifer Freeman, who's going to share what we know about what works for adult learners.
Great. Yeah, this is just a very quick sort of summary, and we'll be going into some of these examples later. But there is a range of program types and policies that mitigate the kinds of barriers that Sam just spoke about. And in a paper that we wrote that drew on examples that came out of the TACT grants, which was a large Department of Labor grant many of you may know about. I think John actually put up a link about this report. So there are examples in that talk about all the different strategies on this slide. I'm not going to go through all of them, but these are kind of the major kinds of strategies that are definitely, many of them active in your state, that provide on-ramps to college entry, that help people get into credit-bearing programs more quickly. And then there's another category of programs that we talked about, looking at program designs, the particular way a program is structured to provide more hands-on learning, and also to sort of help focus on the skills that people gain and not the time they spend. And then there's a constellation of services that are supports that look at what students need, about what their supports are, and how ways that we can help them move along a pathway. And we'll get to these examples later.
Thanks, Jenny. So based on what we know about the challenges facing adults and the programmatic strategies that work in serving them, we're going to spend the remainder of the webinar exploring state policy conditions to dramatically increase the percent of adults with post-secondary education and training. For your consideration, JFF offers this comprehensive reform agenda for transforming our post-secondary systems to focus on what matters most for students in the economy. For our webinar today, we've pulled together elements of the framework that are designed to bring to scale program models that we know work best for adults. It aligns well with policy approaches put out by other national organizations such as SHIO, which emphasize transparent messaging, financial commitment, and programs tailored to the unique needs of adult students. First, JFF recommends that if states are intent on engaging adults, they should set a clear priority and measure progress. Second, because adult learners care most about getting ahead in the workplace, states should be sure to adopt policy strategies focused on aligning post-secondary to what employers and the economy need. Third, JFF recommends that states and post-secondary systems reform how we deliver and assess learning. We have built higher education systems to serve traditional lecture-based full-time learning experiences, by and large, but adults learn differently and need different arrangements to completing their education. Fourth and final, to best serve the needs of adults, states and post-secondary systems must rethink how they allocate financial and human capacity to serve their needs. When pursuing these types of adult-friendly policy solutions, JFF would suggest that states be guided by these 4 principles. All policies should support education training experiences that prepare students to advance in the economy. Eliminate, not reinforce, disparities in education and employment outcomes by race, class, and gender. Scale what works while also catalyzing and supporting innovation, and tearing down silos in education, workforce, and human services in order to meet the holistic needs of students. So in this presentation, I intentionally started with this high-level framework on how state policy can serve as a lever for improving adult outcomes. Next, we are going to get into the weeds about specific policy recommendations, share what we know about adoption of these recommended policies in states, and highlight particular state approaches that we find to be exemplary. Along the way, we have reserved chunks of time for discussion, as John mentioned, for you to share what you are doing and to ask questions of us and one another. First, I referenced that JFF has intel on policy adoption trends. This stems from a recent 16-state policy scan that we conducted in states active in our national network. Although the scan does not cover all states and doesn't include all the states on the line today, we still think the results can be useful and instructive for your work. This is in part because collectively, the states represent a cross-section of the nation in terms of size, governance, and political leadership. In the forthcoming slides, you will see color-coded bar graphs that represent the number and percent of the 16 states in our study that adopted these adult-friendly policies. At a high level, you should focus on the color scheme as an indication of whether these recommended policies are gaining hold in states and where there are critical gaps. So red means low adoption levels, yellow is a middling adoption level, and green is high adoption. So let's dig into the first policy pillar around goal setting and rewarding progress of adult learners. First, on setting a focus on adults, here are the 4 key policy conditions we recommend. States should set and track attainment targets for adults. States should include breakouts for racial and minority groups in those attainment goals. They should track labor market outcomes specifically for adult learners. And fourth, incentivize institutions to expand access and success of adults. And here's what we found in the state scan. As you can see, there's much work to be done in this area, signified by the red color scheme. We did find several exemplary state policies in action, and here are a few approaches that we'd like to point to. In Oregon, the legislature set in motion the development of an attainment goal specifically for adult learners. It complements the goal it set for increasing attainment among young populations. Oregon is seeking to increase the number of degrees, certificates, or credentials earned by adult Oregon residents by 2030 to 300,000, a 50% increase over the 200,000 that are already projected. In Arkansas, the state has set targets for increasing adult enrollment in post-secondary. Beyond setting a goal, it's important to track outcomes. Wisconsin has done this on a regular basis, and I'll explain that more in the next slide. Finally, states have an opportunity to create incentives that reward gains made by adults and rewarding institutions that serve them. Both Ohio and Arkansas have done this in their performance-based funding system by incentivizing completions by adults. So in Wisconsin, each technical college in the state system surveys graduating students and employers served. For students, the colleges check in with them 6 months after graduation and 5 years out. And they get an impressive 26% response rate. These reports are publicly accessible, which serve as an accountability tool for the public and for policymakers. And it also informs the work of practitioners as they see how their students are progressing from college into careers. And importantly, in undertaking the survey, it provides the colleges the opportunity to encourage students to come back to college to pursue additional credentials as appropriate. It's part of their career pathways approach that Wisconsin technical colleges undertake that we'll discuss later in the presentation. So we're going to stop here and turn it over to some discussion for the next few minutes.
Great. Thanks, David, and thank you, JFF team. And that was a great overview of this first element. So what we want to do now is open up the floor for some discussion for folks on the line. So, 3 questions that we would love some initial thoughts on. Folks are willing to share on any of these 3, and these are pretty standard across all of our 3 elements. Where is your state right now on this element? Do you have any additional examples that you feel that you would be potentially beneficial to other states on the call for the group? We found that in the past, this can be a great forum for folks to share other things that they are doing, especially things that may be newer. And then what are some other follow-up questions that you may have for the JFF team about any of the policy frameworks or examples that were just shared? So we'll open up the floor and make sure you unmute yourself if you have a question.
While we wait for folks to type in a question or respond with a comment, I have one for the JFF team. There was kind of an earlier comment highlighting that, one of the major anxieties that individuals are facing right now is just the general uncertainty of the job market. I'd be curious, what are some of your all's thoughts or early ways you've seen people either help adults navigate their educational opportunities given that there's uncertainty in the job market, or otherwise try and deal with that?
Well, I'll take an initial crack at that. Obviously, this is an extraordinary time. And I would say that folks are still kind of working to figure that out. Colleges, we just had an event, a large event that is with several sessions that actually you can look at jff.org to find. It was called Horizons. And one of them was on looking how to look at labor market information, how colleges and states can look at labor market information to try to begin to sort of understand where the opportunities are. And in particular, labor market information that draws on real-time labor market data, meaning like looking at job postings and then analyzing kind of what sorts of jobs appear really not to be coming back as quickly, but looking at the skills people have and finding ways to identify from those jobs that are not coming back what skills apply to jobs that are looking stronger or are beginning to come back. So, long-term traditional sources of labor market data are not so useful at this point in time, but the real market data is useful. So I that's kind of how colleges are beginning to look at it, in my awareness, but it's, obviously it's a really, it's a challenging time right now, but that's the direction folks are going. I don't know if Sam or David, do you have anything to add to that?
I'll just add a few things. I mean, it seems, clear, or there's some signals of this, that, this spring and the economic downturn are accelerating some of the trends in the future of work toward automation and the like, as you've seen that take hold. And so as, colleges look forward, what are those uniquely human and hard skills, those non-repetitive cognitive skills that are really in demand, that that students can, and adults and workers can take and apply in any number of fields, that then obviously complement the technical skills that they would learn for a particular occupation. But having those transferable skills are particularly key as the economy continues to change.
Great. Well, if that time gave us some opportunity to think of other questions, we just wanted to give people a few seconds to type anything in the chat box. Looks like we did have a comment from Stephanie Davidson that they're preparing some recommendations for the adult learner group to include a section on progress for adults, and then there's a grad survey for a college in the Minnesota system. Any other thoughts or questions immediately?
And while I just flip back to this slide, to Stephanie's earlier point asking about the policy recommendations, and so if you just look into the, this on the left-hand side, these are some of the policy recommendations we suggest.
And one thing we did want to do, since we did highlight Ohio on the subsequent slide, just give someone from the Ohio team a quick moment just to talk a little bit about some of the weights that they apply to course and degree completion for students that are 25 and older. So I believe we have Stephanie on the call. Stephanie, would you mind taking just a couple quick minutes to talk a little bit about the Ohio outcomes-based formula in that context? Maybe on mute, Stephanie. We're not hearing you. Oh. Well, looks like, oops, sorry. There we go, Stephanie. Sorry about that.
Oh, good. Okay. You can hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. Yes, one of the things we've been doing performance funding for, well, they first put together the recommendations in 2012. So it's been a number of years now. But one of the things from the very start was that we wanted to make sure that we incentivized certain populations, and adults was one of those. We also incentivize institutions based on the race of their students and based on the economic status of their students. Specifically for adults, there is a weight associated with it. So anytime an adult student completes a course or completes a degree or certificate, not only does the institution get credit for that completion, but they also get a weight associated with it. So that was specifically put in there to make sure that adults, that institutions spent time attracting adults to their campuses, and then also put the resources in that they needed to help them complete their courses and their certificates and degrees.
Thanks, Stephanie. Well, in the interest of time, we're going to go ahead and move on to the next section, which I think will be of interest, as I know at least a couple of the teams, if not more, have been really looking at regional talent development needs. So David, I'll pass it back to you, but before I do, I just wanted to highlight very quickly that there have been a number of links that we've dropped into the chat box, and we'll be putting together a collection of these, and we'll send them out after the webinar is concluded today to folks.
Thanks, John. So the second pillar, policy pillar, is about focusing on regional talent development. And here are the 4 policy conditions we recommend. First, states have a role in fostering regional collaboration among education and workforce to align programs and services to in-demand careers. Second, to expand the use of industry sector strategies to address regional talent development needs. Third, to incentivize development of demand-driven programs, which can include short-term certificates. And fourth, to expand apprenticeship and paid high-quality work-based learning experiences for post-secondary students, and to do so in ways that ensure that adult students qualify for those efforts. And in our policy scan, we found that roughly about, this is a policy area that is gaining traction. About half of the states in our study are putting these kinds of policies into place. And here are a few state approaches we'd like to point to. So Wisconsin has a strong tradition of working across systems to develop college and career pathways tied to labor market demand at regional state levels. And one way that they've done this is that they've constructed a statewide pathways committee to kind of organize this work and keep it going. Several states fund and support sector strategies, and within our network, New Jersey is one of those states that has a industry sector partnership initiative. And several states also are running statewide initiatives to expand work-based learning initiatives. And we've listed a few there. And I should note, we've noted statewide efforts. So in California, the California Community College Chancellor Office has an apprenticeship initiative with grant money. New Jersey has a wide-ranging a number of kind of internship programs for different target audiences. Washington also has a whole robust effort around connecting education to careers called the Career Connect Initiative. On top of that, they also fund work study positions at colleges that are state funded, so not just the federal work study. And in doing that, they've targeted to make them meaningful career experiences, and they've provided some of those kinds of positions utilizing TANF funding for eligible students. So innovative ways of boosting work-based learning. So I'm going to turn it over to Jenny to talk about one of the deeper dive examples we want to give.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. So many of you, I understand, are from Minnesota. So this is something that you're probably quite familiar with, the Learn, Work, and Earn program. It's, to my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, it started at South Central College as an initiative, started there through their TACT grant, and now has been expanded statewide. And I think there's a link John can share to the statewide initiative. But in any case, this is an example of the kind of sector approach that that David is talking about. It's an approach that ensures that programming is really aligned with regional, with industry credentials, that it provides career pathways, so a way for people to sort of earn entry-level credentials and then a higher level credentials to move up. It relies on credit for prior learning so that people who have experience can come in and come in at a higher level and not have to spend time in a classroom or spend time learning something that they already know. And it really aligns, so in addition to sort of aligning closely with industry need, it addresses programs like this. Apprenticeship programs and other kinds of hands-on learning programs address some of the characteristics that Sam talked about that adults need. So hands-on learning, and in this case, people are being paid as they learn, and the learning is happening hands-on and in the workplace, which again is such a critical and important tool to help people ultimately obtain a position if they can actually get some work-based experience and meet employers while they're working, while they're learning. So I think, I know we're a little behind on time, so that's as much as I'm going to say about that. I'll also just say, though, that there are many states have, as David said, initiatives that really help their educators speak collectively to employers and vice versa. So this really helps colleges. If there's a coordinated state effort like this, it helps colleges understand what the industry needs are to build curriculum, not to sort of be building very individualized programs for individual employers, but understanding the industry overall. And it helps employers kind of communicate their needs more broadly, and so that the state can kind of build a strategy around it. And my understanding is that's what's happening in Minnesota. So why don't we, so I think enough for that, and we can come back to questions if there are any later.
Thanks, Jennifer. One of the other policy levers that we talked about was kind of the state or systems role for designing labor market demand driven programs and to fund or incentivize that work. And so the next two examples speak to that. And this one is about the Virginia Fast Forward initiative, which is a pay for performance system for expanding short-term industry aligned certificate programs. Colleges get paid based on the education employment outcomes of students. And this really changes the incentives for colleges for what kinds of programming they offer, and it holds them accountable to employment outcomes. The results have been great, as you can see, based on some of the data that we're sharing here, and especially for adult learners. Some of the wage increases are as high as 80%. And this is an initiative that, at a state level that works across all the community colleges in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Whereas Virginia is incentivizing short-term programs, the University System of Georgia is attempting to reimagine the degree programs in a way that combine job-specific skills development and the type of critical thinking and analytical skills that students are more likely to learn in academic programs. They call it a NEXUS degree, and it includes it's a 60 credit hour degree. 42 credit hours are in kind of a broad range of general education, including at least 12 credits in upper division coursework. So courses that would typically be offered a junior or senior year at a university, although this is considered an associate's degree. Importantly, the NEXUS degree includes 18 credit hours focused on skills and knowledge required for a high demand industry, and often it leads to an industry recognized certificate, and 6 credit hours in experiential learning and some kind of work-based learning. So this is a kind of new kind of associate degree, one targeted toward high need technical field. It's stackable. Students can kind of do their industry certificate, work-based learning, the gen ed courses, and different kinds of combinations and at different times, and put it all together to get the degree. And so far, a couple colleges have unveiled new NEXUS degrees. At Columbus State, they have one in film production. Georgia is really a mecca now for the film industry. And at Albany State, they offer 2 NEXUS degrees, one in blockchain with machine learning and the other in blockchain with data analytics. So kind of future of work oriented. So that kind of concludes our second part, and now for more discussion.
Great, thanks, David. And just for reference, I will drop the element into the chat box, focusing on regional talent development needs. So I know we have a couple of states in that one that was presented on, Minnesota, and then Louisiana, which has been doing some specific work in this area around one of their regions, Arcadiana. So was interested to see if either someone from the Minnesota or Louisiana teams would be interested in talking a bit more about what they're doing in that respect. All right. Seems like there will be no uptake on that particular question. We'll presume that you guys did a wonderful job highlighting them. Let's see here.
There was one question
thank you, Mike.
earlier in the chat. I think it was right before this this section, but from Andrea. Are there policies the states are looking at to further address an increase or address an increase of support to support the needs of students, particularly BIPOC, that can impede enrollment and attainment? So in the examples you just mentioned, or just generally, how are you all seeing states, particularly in this time, address some of those equity concerns when it comes to enrollment and ultimately attainment?
You know, Dave, do you have an answer to that, or have something?
Well, interesting. I mean, so this stems back to some of the conversations we had last week at JFF Horizons, to which we were talking about kind of the current moment, racial injustices, and had a discussion about disaggregated data, and that's a movement that a lot of states are moving toward institutions, that we do look into data by different demographics of populations, but oftentimes, too often, we warehouse this data. We don't act upon it. We don't change policies. We don't change programs. We don't kind of change some of our structures based on what we're seeing to be the disparities and outcomes, access and outcomes of those populations. So that's a tool that I think, you know, and in our policy framework, we talk about the importance of regularly publishing kind of reports that that share these outcomes, which help to kind of raise up them on, you know, on the radar of policymakers, of the public, and helping us all just kind of remain accountable to our most marginalized population. So I would just share that as one. There could be others, but I just wanted to share the point about data first.
Yeah. And then what also occurs to me when you're talking about ways to increase enrollment and attainment of underserved populations, I think we mentioned a few strategies, and I think we'll be circling back to them in the next set of examples. But some of the strategies that reduce barriers to the barriers that Sam was talking about are ultimately help to increase enrollment of adults. So for example, credit for prior learning policies that allow people to be tested and assessed for what they know, for credentials they already may have from a previous job. That helps them. That is a real incentive to getting people to enroll, because they realize then it takes less time to complete, and they don't have to sit in a classroom and learn stuff they already know. The example I showed about programs that allow you to earn money as you're learning and provide you real world workplace experience, again, hugely helpful in attracting adults. Things that that make it extremely clear that a job is that you'll go pretty quickly, ideally earn while you learn, and then also that there's going to be a job at the end of the day, that really tie tightly the learning outcomes to what the actual job needs are. Again, are just strategies to increase enrollment. And then other ways to help enrollment for people who may have, to help speed up the process for people who may enter with some foundational skill deficits, skill, math or reading skills that aren't considered college ready. There are, as many of you are aware, there's a host of developmental education reforms that have gone on that are designed specifically so that people can build those foundational skills while they're gaining, while they're enrolled in credit-bearing courses, while they're gaining occupational skills. So those are some of the ways.
And that is a perfect segue, actually, Jenny, for us to move to our next segment, which is that touches about college readiness among some other policy areas. Or before I do that, any other kind of final thoughts? Or I have the green light to continue us moving along.
I think you're good. Go ahead, David.
Alrighty. So the third policy pillar is about making post-secondary programs more accessible for adult learners. And in this area, we're calling out again 4 key policy conditions that we think matter most for adults. So one, ensuring that short-term certificates stack to degree programs or embedded in degree programs, and that there's a overall support of kind of lifelong learning. 2, as Jenny mentioned, about ensuring that we're awarding credit for prior learning, which kind of accelerates learning opportunities and credential completion for adults. 3 is really this point around developmental education redesign, alleviating academic barriers to program entry for adult learners. And 4, incentivize accessible approaches to course structures and delivery, really those approaches that work best for adult learners. So in this area, again, we're seeing that about half of states have some of these kind of adult-friendly program and pathway models in place, and many are working to alleviate barriers in DevEd. We didn't scan for these kind of accessible approaches to course structures and delivery, but we'll talk about that during this segment of the webinar. So, so we did want to share some of these exemplary approaches. So in stackable certificates, what are roles that states can play? So both the Wisconsin Technical College system has put out statewide guidance for how you stack credentials. Florida has an articulation agreement process for certificates to stack into degree programs. A lot of states are working on credit for prior learning. California has a whole policy here. Jenny could perhaps talk more about that. Other mechanisms, Virginia has a kind of an online platform targeted to veterans on how they can gain credit for their military experience. And they have a whole sort of consumer-directed website to make that transparent and easy for them to navigate. And then on kind of removing academic barriers, you know, we scanned for scaling various evidence-based developmental education redesign efforts like code requisite, like contextualized basic education, and around the use of multiple measures for assessment and placement, and found a lot of movement there. So North Carolina is an example of a state that is a real leader in multiple measures, and they've recently expanded their policy to include adult learners. Oftentimes, multiple measures are targeted toward recent high school students, but here they've taken the leap forward to include adults, and thereby downplaying the need for high stakes entrance exams. And then other states like Texas and California really leading in the effort to scaling co-requisite, among other efforts. And Washington State's been a longtime leader on the IBES model. So I'll turn it back over to Jenny to talk about some of these best practice program models.
Yeah, so David mentioned that stackable pathways is a really important model to help adults get in and earn an industry recognized credential quickly. And to someone's previous question about how do you increase enrollment, I mean, that is one way to increase enrollment, is just allow someone to earn something in a relatively short time frame that allows them to enter the job, but then ideally, or if they choose to, continue on in order to gain an additional credential and move up a sort of credentialing ladder, as you're seeing in front of you, to ever higher positions within that industry. So this is a little hard to read, I realize, and you will be sharing the slides. You can take a look at it. It comes from Northeast Wisconsin Technical College, and as David said, there's support for building career pathways across Wisconsin, and we included the links, and you'll get that too after this session. But so this is just one example. So there are Wisconsin colleges are building these pathways like this in multiple industries. They're basically analyzing the industry, entry-level credentials in industry, creating programs that are directly tied to them, that build skills for that credential, and then continuing on from that, building skills, building programs that tie to the next credential up the ladder, et cetera, et cetera. And importantly, it's all very visible to students. So the fact that it's all laid out like this, that where it tells you what kind of skills you need, what the credential is that you gain, what the wage level is, all of that is very important in terms of being able to kind of help adults map out their path. And then colleges will also support students to kind of map out their own pathway, help them understand, like, if you get this first job, how you might also then continue to be able to continue to go on in school, to be able to continue to move up. Healthcare is an industry, especially where the employer might actually pay for them to go to school and continue into that next phase. So that's how a stackable credential pathway works. And I just, want to underscore the fact that it's visible to students in this way is really important. And also the fact that it's a statewide system in this case helps colleges to build it, helps them to more quickly understand the competencies and skills needed in for different industry pathways, helps them choose pathways that are aligned with the jobs that are most in need in that local labor market.
Thanks, Jenny. I wanted to add one more element to this story about Wisconsin, and that is, it's a really interesting innovation. For the colleges, they tag students that are in short-term certificate programs. They tag them as being in that long-term degree pathway. And what that does is that makes them eligible for financial aid, which has always been this thorny issue around, what do we do about short-term certificate programs that don't qualify for financial aid? Well, in this, because they've constructed these really seamless pathways, they've stacked these certificates within, embed them into degree programs. Students, whether they've sort of said that they were declaring a degree, are qualified and are eligible for financial aid. And when that student leaves, let's say they get that short-term certificate, the colleges, part of that outcome report that I was talking about, they make a real effort to reach back out to their students that have since left, check in with them, see how things are going, encourage them to come back and continue on their pathway. And so it's really intentional about helping students get what they need now and helping them come back and pursue advanced education. So next we'll move to Kentucky.
Thanks, David. So Kentucky's another great example of a statewide system doing something really well for adults. And in this case, their innovation is really around accessibility. So Kentucky Learn on Demand is an online competency-based education model. Back in 2006, the system sent out a survey to prospective adult students without a degree and found they were 3 times more likely to enroll in entirely online courses than traditional courses. And that led to the development of this program. So Kentucky Learn on Demand is all online and asynchronous. There's multiple start dates each term. And what this means is that time barrier that adult learners face is dealt with really well. They can fit in their education whenever they have a spare moment here and there. They can fit it around their child's care, and they don't have to be in class at particular times. They can also start when they want within a given term. The next thing that really distinguishes it is its options for acceleration, and deceleration is an important part of this too. So because of their competency-based approach, students move at their own pace as they master the material. The structure of a course is typically a pre-test, 5 or 6 modules, and a post-test. So if a student is really getting the content, really has a lot of time, is mastering it, they can accelerate and finish in as quickly as 6 weeks. But if they're taking a little more time to master concepts, or if they need a break because life just gets in the way, busy at work, moving, they can pause for a little bit without really falling behind in the course, and they can take up to 15 weeks to finish and get credit. Now, what's really wonderful about this is that credit for prior learning is built right into this model. So I'd mentioned before there's a pre-test and a post-test. If a student essentially aces the pre-test, they can have the option to skip all those modules and take a post-test immediately. If a student does well on the post-test, they just get that credit for that course essentially at a reduced price. There is also student supports built into this program. Success coaches help students enroll, navigate that credit for prior learning components, deal with financial aid, and plan what classes they need to take to reach their goals. The instructors are available online, but there are also online tutors to help really build out that support if students are not able to attend a tutoring center on campus. So I think this is a really wonderful model for accessibility. I'd love to see it replicated more. And I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Jenny on integrated pathways in Louisiana.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Sam. So I know that a few of you are from Louisiana, so you are familiar with this, of course. Louisiana has developed an integrated career pathways program that integrates college level work with adult basic education. This started as a TAC program called Train to Attain, and it was so successful, it has now become the way that Louisiana offers to all of their adult basic education students. So anyone who's working toward a HiSET, their high school equivalency, the HiSET exam, can also be duly enrolled in an occupational training program, a short-term credentialing program. It is all of the hands-on training programs. These short-term programs are credit-bearing in Louisiana, and they build programs that are with credentials that are approved by local industry. What the programs are really depends on particular colleges and depends on that particular labor market around that college. Employability skills are embedded throughout. So when someone completes their HiSET, they also at the same time, or have graduated with their HiSET, have at the same time college credits under their belt and a credential. They can enter a job, or they can enter into another degree program or longer term certificate program at a Louisiana community college. So that one thing I just want to say one thing just for your understanding of context here. This is the iBest model, which some of you may be familiar with from Washington State. This is kind of mirrors that, as well as accelerating opportunity. So if you are, wanting to know more about this kind of model, you can Google those things.
Great, thank you guys. That was some great examples. We did have one question come in via the chat, but I believe everyone, there were a couple folks who had some issues with the speaking part, but everyone should now have access to be able to unmute. So do we have any questions folks wanted to also submit verbally or also in the chat box before we jump on to the one that was already submitted? Well, while folks are thinking, the question that we got in the chat box from Stephanie Davidson in Ohio was interested in hearing more about the California prior learning policy. So JFF folks, is there anyone who could talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I can speak to that. I worked with California about a year ago. The California Chancellor's Office wanted to establish a statewide policy around credit for prior learning. Individual colleges, what happens other places too, is that individual colleges might have a credit for prior learning policy on the books, but it's not well understood by students. It's not marketed to students as a way to help adults enter. And even, sort of staff and faculty are not sort of uniformly trained around it. So it doesn't really get much traction. So in California, and in Colorado and Minnesota, as many of you know, other places, they've established a statewide policy that says colleges must provide a process to determine credit for prior learning, and make it, sort of visible, market it to students. And then a number of states, and California is working on this, provide resources to help their colleges do that, to sort of provide guidance about how many credits might you offer for some of the standard certifications that people might enter in with from industries, that kind of thing. Methods of assessment, all of that. So that's what I can tell you about California. I also saw this question about someone asked about the Louisiana question or example. And yes, you have interpreted it correctly. When people are in an ABE program, they are also enrolled in college level work. So the way that works is that there is hands-on occupational training at the same, and the foundational skills, the math and reading, the foundational skills that they're working on through their ABE program are contextualized. And so the faculty person, with the help of the state and working with ABE instructors, will basically build into the curriculum the sort of basic foundational math reading requirements, so that they build those skills as they're working on particular occupational programs.
From a policy perspective, Washington and North Carolina have done some important things to make that affordable for those kinds of students. So the Washington Opportunity Grant, unlike many financial aid programs, does not require students to have a high school diploma or a GED. So those IBEST students can get financial aid while they're in those IBEST type programs. In North Carolina, through their Basic Skills Plus program, they work around this by doing tuition waivers. So they waive tuition for students that are in their similar type of strategy. So that's some more to think about from a policy perspective.
Are there any other questions as folks have had an opportunity to think a little bit more? I did have a quick question I wanted to just pose to you all, and sorry to put you on the spot, but this has been at the top of our minds a bit since with everything that's been going on with the pandemic. But I was curious if within your networks, have you all been seeing any movement recently, especially related to the pandemic, on some of these topics, especially related to scaling adult-friendly programs and pathways? There have been federal dollars coming out. Different states have been thinking about things differently. Is there anything that you have all been able to, you could speak to on that point?
Yeah, I turn it over to Sam or Ashley to talk about California CVE.
Sure. So California had already had plans to start exploring a pilot for competency-based education, but with so many people out of work and needing a pathway back to new credentials and new careers, there's been a lot more momentum around that. And it's looking like, and Ashley, you should jump in and give the good details, but there's hope that within a couple years, pilots will start at a few colleges. And there's a very strong equity principle being baked into all the early planning discussions.
Yeah, thank you, Sam. I would just add, and off of both John and Sam's points, the California Community College System was, as Sam mentioned, already considering how to bring CVE system-wide to all their colleges, which is a really ambitious endeavor on their behalf. And so with, in response to our current crisis, the work, just the urgency of the work has really sped up, both on the design and on the policy front, because that naturally, as you all know, whichever model they end up going with in terms of competency-based education across their system will require and necessitate certain both institutional but state level policy adjustments and shifts. And so a lot of their conversations right now have been, how are we setting up those conditions as fast as possible to be able to move forward with a launch of sorts that will be a 2 to 3 year timeline because it is a significant process. And so that's where they are, is the focus on the design and setting up the policy conditions to support implementation of these efforts.
John, the other example I would just give is that kind of out of necessity, a lot of colleges have had to move to multiple measures because, proctored in-person exams haven't been possible this spring. And so this is a evidence-based approach. We know that GPA, high school GPA, for instance, is a very strong indicator of what someone's capable of doing at college. So says Community College Research Center. We also know that, that adult learners really can and should be empowered to make their own self-direct decisions and where they think they ought to be placed. And so those kind of efforts are going underway in North Carolina and a lot of other states and institutions. But, when you talk, there's some whispers that this is a temporary thing, that we're doing this at an emergency, but we might move back to our kind of standard assessment and placement practices. And I would just, encourage to follow the lead of those states and institutions that are kind of boldly taking hold of the evidence and moving away from exams that have long tripped individuals and students into DevEd, where they are quite unlikely to ever complete a credential.
Thanks, guys. I know we're bumping a little bit up on the discussion time for this, but we did get one more question in the chat box. Just want to see if anyone has any quick reactions on, and if we have some more time in the next chat, we could come back to it. But the question was, what are some of the most successfully and appealing programs that we've seen regarding technical certificate to degree programs? So does anyone have any quick thoughts that they want to share on that?
I guess I'll just say, there are so many. There are maybe too many to name. There are a lot of in manufacturing, in particular, in Wisconsin, in Minnesota, in Florida, in Iowa. There have been, over the last several years, as there have been increases in certain types of manufacturing, there have been big pushes to really reach out to adults and get them into programming that then is stacked to associate degrees in applied engineering and things like that. So I don't know off the top of my head. So I know of programs like that that are very impressive. I would actually, if you want to, skillscommons.org is a place where you can find some many examples of those kinds of programs that came about through TACT. That's what I would add.
Thanks, Jennifer. Appreciate it. Well, for sake of time, we'll go ahead and we'll move on to our last category. David, the floor is yours.
Thanks, John. So the fourth policy pillar is about committing financial and human resources to serving the holistic needs of adult learners. We've kind of been already talking about this in a lot of the examples that we've provided thus far. And we've named, again, 4 policy conditions that we think states ought to take. So first, provide targeted outreach and support for returning adults. 2, target financial aid to short-term programs and ensure that adults qualify for that aid. 3, target financial aid to adults without a diploma or GED, and I already mentioned a few examples there. And 4th, expand eligibility and access to public benefits and workaround supports. And in this area, we see across the nation a lot of work that has been done and more work that needs to be done, signified by the kind of the red and yellow boxes. So, like in every other case, we do know of and would like to point to some exemplars in this area. And so North Carolina stands out as one state for a variety of reasons. So one, they've leveraged the SNAP employment and training dollars, the 50-50 match, to build out, to fund a set of navigators that are working in 13 of the community colleges there. And these navigators offer assistance to students who participate in food and nutrition support programs to help them achieve their education goals. North Carolina is also partnering, and the North Carolina community colleges are also partnering with the University of North Carolina system to create a unified online portal called Adult Promise that offers tailored college advising and financial aid information for returning adults and adults who are new to a post-secondary education. And finally, the governor in that state is leveraging the kind of WIOA discretionary funds to provide an emergency grant program to students. It's called the Finish Line Grant, to students who are experiencing some financial hardships on their way to completion, and to fund, to support them in overcoming that. So those are just that's one state that's taking a holistic approach to all this. A number of states have looked to make students eligible for food stamps and expanding eligibility for SNAP specifically for students enrolled in CTE programs. Michigan recently announced that effort. And finally, I would just point to particularly what's relevant now as in this economic downturn. There are states that are looking to help students who are experiencing student loan default and offering incentives to avoid those defaults if they come back and get back into school and continue their studies. And New York is a state that is doing that work. So I'm going to just turn it over to Sam to talk about a deeper dive example here.
Thanks, David. And so Tennessee Reconnect covers a lot of what you just talked about in terms of holistic supports. So it starts with a grant. The Tennessee Reconnect grant is a last dollar grant that fills the gap after state and federal financial aid has already been applied. And this grant is open to all adults without degrees who want to pursue a new degree or get a technical diploma. But it's not enough to just provide these grants. It's important to provide a way to navigate and get access to these grants in the rest of the system. And so that's where the navigators that David mentioned earlier come in. What's interesting about the navigators in the Tennessee Reconnect program is they're not attached to a particular college. They're statewide. And so you connect with a navigator, they can recommend the college and or program that's closest or best for you, because it might be one or two. And they remain with you throughout the rest of your journey through college, giving you guidance, helping you access the financial aid, as well as helping you plan your courses for the outcomes that you really want and need. And then finally, there's a great credit for prior learning component, TimeWise Tennessee. What's interesting about this credit for prior learning initiative is that you can do it by exam, by an examination of your past trainings that you have documented, or a portfolio of your work. So it gives adult learners a lot of options and flexibility in demonstrating that prior learning rather than just confining it to exam. And if you do choose that option, you get that credit for a fraction of what the normal tuition cost would be. And I'll hand it over to Dave to talk about Arkansas Career Pathways.
Absolutely. I just also want to make a point about Michigan recently authorized their own Reconnect type program. It's still awaiting funding, but similar to Tennessee, they've kind of taken a comprehensive approach. It's not just a free tuition or college promise type program. They've also molded in some reform efforts to DevEd. So thinking about kind of holistically what students need, and adults in particular, it's for adults. So the other example I wanted to point to, and I understand that this was a topic of a previous webinar when you talked about graded funding, is the Arkansas Career Pathways effort. Here, this is an example of a state that several years ago made the decision to utilize its TANF block grant money to support education and training wraparound supports for students, eligible students enrolled in community college. They also made the point that that while federal law kind of prohibits the amount of time that TANF eligible people can access and get counted toward education and training, that they've extended that time so that people can stay in college and complete their degree. And even though they get kind of dinged in the federal metrics for that reason. and they've had great success serving tons of students. The students that are served get access to wraparound supports. They're in in-demand programs, and they're actually doing, they have better kind of persistence and completion rates than the average community college student in the state. So it just goes to show when you kind of expend the effort and the support and extra resources that students are able to do quite well. So I'll kind of stop there, and we have time for more discussion.
Great, thanks, David and JFF team. This is our last element, so great time to ask any questions on this one or anything that may have popped up on previous elements. Feel free to unmute yourself or drop it in the chat box. Well, David, as people think, and JFF team collectively, I'd ask the question during these times that we find ourselves in, what advice would you have, I think, especially on top of what you already talked about as far as committing resources to aligning these systems to support adult learners, given the present context that a lot of states find themselves in?
Well, I would just say, so, going back to this example of TANF, of SNAP, so there are federal dollars on the table. And we know some states aren't spending all of their TANF money. And this is a time, this is an opportunity. There are people in need. We know what they need is additional education, training, supports to utilize those resources. Likewise with SNAP, it's really, if you can find the 50%, there's this sort of entitled pot of money at a federal level that's 50-50 match. So there's ways of even in cash-strapped states to consider what measures you can take to utilize federal money in different and better ways. So that's just one example. There could be others.
Yeah. Well, I would say too, just to be aware that the Department of Labor back in January actually there had been some funding designated for the Department of Labor, and we are still expecting an RFP to come out that specifically funds colleges to do labor market aligned training, short-term training. So just echoing what Dave said, there are, just keeping your eye on federal and state dollars that focus on training. I imagine more will come. And then looking at strategies that not only have you developing short-term programs, because really people need to get back into the workforce with this high level of unemployment, developing those short-term programs, but also really carefully thinking about what those programs can lead to, and doing some of the work that David mentioned, like in creating systems so that people are able to come back and apply those short-term certificates to something more so that they can continue along a career path.
I think we have time for one more question. If anybody wants to unmute or drop it in the chat box, we'll give folks a couple of seconds to do so. All right, hearing none, David, if you would not mind going ahead and advancing us to the recap and the closing.
And this is Ashley. Again, I can jump in just to help wrap us up with just a couple minutes left for this webinar. So we just wanted to make sure that we included an overall slide. We know we covered a lot of information and a lot of examples in various policy areas. So what you are looking at right now are simply the four pillars essentially that we covered when we dove into these details. And then you'll see we have the policy areas listed below, and what you see in bold are the examples. And my understanding is you receive a copy of these slides, so please, kind of see this one for summary, and then we're happy to continue engaging with you all individually or through NGA to provide more detail where helpful. Next slide. We also just want to make a friendly partner plug that if we do have a JFF policy e-newsletter that we send out. So if you are interested in staying abreast of what we have in our policy shop, please email our colleague Alex at the email that's listed there, and he'll get you onto our newsletter. And lastly, when you receive a copy of these slides, if you want to just go to the next slide, I just want to point out quickly, we've included a few slides that we're not going to go into detail, but some extra additional resources that we thought this group may find helpful. So you'll see 4 or 5 slides at the end of the PowerPoint presentation that mentions a few other reports and frameworks that for your review. The one we do want to highlight that we just released publicly last week is our vision for, what we're calling our vision for equitable economic recovery, which is a policy framework really including a set of 3 policy pillars that you see there on the screen, in addition to 4 guiding principles, and really just providing a roadmap for how we think the country can keep moving forward in our crisis to really ensure that we're delivering a promise of economic advancement for all, and really emphasizing that, our systems and our institutions and our individuals shouldn't be looking to just get back to normal, because what we have all learned, right, is that normal would be getting back to a time maybe when systems and institutions were already failing many people. So really, as we're progressing forward, let's aim for something better than normal. And so that's what our framework essentially covers and talks about. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you again for having us, and I'll pass it on to John and Mike for final words.
Of course, and we'll keep it short, but thank you so much to everyone on the JFF team, David, Jennifer, Ashley, Sam. It's been great having you all on. These are some great examples, and hopefully will help inform some of the work of our team members and Educate for Opportunity. And just again to reiterate, we'll send out some of the resources that were presented on this webinar as a follow-up. With that, I will give my colleague, Michael Bartlett, the last word. Mike, is there anything you'd like to add?
No. Thank you all so much for your time. This has been incredibly informative. And again, we'll be sharing all of these really great links, resources, and tools with everyone who is here today, and also everyone who was unable to join.
Great. Well, thank you all so much. And with that, we will conclude our 4th Educate for Opportunity Innovation webinar. Have a great day.
Good to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Thank you.